Good morning, everyone. Oh, I saw a few of you jump. How'd everybody sleep? Good? Well rested, ready for a nice big weekend full of wonderful speakers. Welcome officially to the MUFON Symposium 2021. We are thrilled to see such a big crowd of people here. And welcome everybody watching at home. Thank you for tuning in. I think it's kind of fitting that we're having it here in sunny Las Vegas, given all the UFO and UAP activity in this region over the past 7 decades and more. And like I said, we have a packed schedule, lots going on. We're going to have a lunch break around 1, dinner break around 4. And if everything runs on schedule, and I'm going to try and make sure it does, we should have 10 to 15 minutes between speakers. So if you have to leave at any point, that's okay. If you arrive a little bit late, that's okay. But if I could just ask you to be really mindful of the sound of the door opening and closing. I know many of you have been to many conferences, and there's nothing more distracting than getting really wrapped up in a speaker, and all of a sudden there's that click of the door constantly. So just take an extra second to be really mindful of that. It'd be very much appreciated. And I'll have a few announcements throughout the day. We'll get to those later. But right now, we are kicking off this conference in the most auspicious of ways with someone who has done so much to bring what was once really a fringe topic into the mainstream. Now, in 1981, he landed a job as a general assignment reporter for KLAS-TV, and honestly hasn't slowed down since. He's earned 5 regional and 1 national Edward R. Murrow Award for his investigative stories, the prestigious Peabody Award twice, and 28 Emmys. He's a 9-time recipient of the Mark Twain Award for the Best News Writing from the Associated Press. And in 1990, his series about UFOs was selected by the United Press International as Best in the Nation for individual achievement by a journalist. And of course, we have all enjoyed him so much with his interviews on Coast to Coast AM over the years. His dedication to covering the UFO topic is absolutely legendary. Please welcome Mr. George Knapp.
All right, so anybody who knows me knows that I'm the least tech-savvy person in the world, so I'm going to screw this up at some point, so I'm apologizing in advance. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all losing lots of money, losing the mortgage payment last night and this morning. Las Vegas needs to bounce back. You know, we need all the help we can get. I think I'm really pleased to be here to welcome MUFON, the symposium, back to Las Vegas. For me, there's a great deal of synchronicity in this, and things have sort of come full circle, as I'll explain today. You know, Las Vegas is such a great news town, which is why people in my line of work really love working here. We have so much money and power and corruption and crime and celebrities that there's never really a slow news day in Las Vegas. And we have a saying that we sort of jokingly say that all major news stories are related to Las Vegas in some way. There's a Las Vegas angle for anything that happens pretty much anywhere in the world. That is certainly true for the UFO story, as we're going to explore today. 1989 is sort of when I started my deep dive into the UFO pool. We were working on a multi-part series it's focused on a lot about Area 51 and Bob Lazar and all those allegations, and it looked at the broader perspective of how they fit into the UFO story in general. So I started working on that in May of 1989, and just out of sheer luck, the MUFON International Symposium that year was here. And I don't know if you've read much about that symposium, but sparks were flying. A lot of notable things happened, a lot of notable speakers. But for me, just starting down the road, it was such a wonderful opportunity to get to see the luminaries of the UFO world in action, to figure out who was credible and who was not, who was crazy and who, well, we're all crazy, right? Stan Friedman, the great Walt Andrus, who led MUFON all those years, they were here, and I got to see what the UFO field was all about at that point, just as I was taking the deep dive into the topic. It put me on the road that I'm still traveling all these years later. That news project that we started back then, UFOs, the Best Evidence, was a big hit here. It was bootlegged and seen all over the world. And it really got me hooked, and it got other people hooked, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. When it comes to UFO issues, it's no exaggeration that all roads lead to Las Vegas. The monumental shift that's underway right now in terms of the media attitude, mainstream media reporting, the attitude of Congress, the grudging changes in attitude among the scientific professionals, I think all of that stuff can be traced back to Las Vegas and what started here back in 1989. Along the way today, we're going to be talking about some acronyms. Here's my first technical challenge, whether I can get this to work. So, let's see. No? This is going to be a comedy of errors here. Okay. All right. So don't touch that. Yeah, that's not going to happen again. So we're going to talk about some notable acronyms. ATIP, of course, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. AWSAP, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program. That was the granddaddy. That was the mother program, as you're going to learn here today. BASS was the subcontractor, it's a sub-company of Bigelow Aerospace that was created to house the program that we're going to talk about. DIA, that's where the program was housed. The DWO, the Defense Warning Office, is the part of DIA that managed the program. NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science that Robert Bigelow created back in the mid-1990s, has a definite role in all the things that we're going to be covering today. And of course, the New York Times story, which kind of really kicked things off. That story, the New York Times story, December 27th, 2017, really got things going. And as good as that story was, and as influential as it got a lot of things wrong. The main error that it got wrong is ATIP did not get $22 million. ATIP didn't have a budget at all. The $22 million that was secured by Harry Reid went to a program called AWSAP, not ATIP. Let's see. All right, 1989, as I said, the focus of the reports, one focus of the reports that we were working on was Groom Lake, S4, Area 51, the possibility that we might have recovered technology, that we're reverse engineering some kind of advanced technology as opposed to building technology out there in the desert. And it was a pivotal year for us, as I mentioned, and the stories went all over the world, and one of the people who saw them and became interested is Senator Harry Reid. So I had known Harry Reid for a long time. 1982, the first year he ran for the House of Representatives, I covered that campaign. Reid had been chairman of the Nevada Gaming Commission during a time when the state of Nevada was trying to weed the mob out of our casino industry. It was a very tumultuous time, a dangerous time. He had death threats, all kinds of things that were going on back then, as many people did. But he sort of earned his bones in that position, and then he ran for the House in 1982, and he won. In 84, he ran again, and I covered that campaign as well. In 86, he ran for the U.S. Senate, and that was the first of 5 terms. So he eventually rose to become the Senate Majority Leader. Very powerful position, the most powerful position any Nevadan has ever had in the federal government. So he was a guy that I got to know from covering those campaigns, and he was smart. He has a backbone of steel. I know he's not everyone's cup of tea when it comes to political persuasions, but it was a relationship that I had nurtured over the years. And when I started working on the Area 51 stuff, I went to see Harry Reid. He was the first person I told about it outside of our newsroom. And I gave him this story. We had a brief interview in a limo on the way to airport where he was flying back to Washington. And I told him a story, not only about the allegations about what was hidden out in the desert, but the broader perspective that I was just then studying about the UFO cover-up in general. And he didn't kick me out of the car. That was a good sign. He was interested in it. He said, let's stay in touch about it. And we did over the next 30 plus years. It was a very subtle sort of a communication. I would go back to Washington a couple times a year to interview him and other members of the Nevada congressional delegation about issues of the day. And each time he'd go back there, he and I would pull off to the side and have a little secret conversation about UFOs. It drove his staff crazy because he wouldn't tell them what we were talking about. And he helped me a great deal over the years. He would help me secure things, information that I needed that I couldn't get on my own. For example, the 1966 and 68 congressional hearings into UFOs are out of print. He got him to print me off a copy. There was a Congressional Research Service report written for members of Congress, a really comprehensive document that allowed members of Congress to know, how do I answer a question about UFOs? I did a really deep dive. If you haven't ever seen it, it's available online, but it wasn't available to anyone back then, and I got a copy of that. So he helped me, and then I would keep him informed about what's going on in UFO world. This is going to be trouble. Let's see.
I think, as you're aware, Senator, this week we've been taking a look at UFOs and some of the evidence surrounding that. What we found is perhaps not all government agencies have been completely on the up and up with the American people about what they know. I'm wondering what it would take, whether there'd be any appetite for Congress to jump back and take a look at the subject.
George, you know, in the past, Congress has looked into this. There have been congressional hearings on this subject before. And I have, in fact, I'm going to do it tonight. I'm going to watch your tapes. They've recorded those for me. And if they're as good as some people say, we might have to look at it again.
Well, what you're going to see tonight is a man who says he worked for the Navy on flying saucers here in Nevada, that he's been threatened and harassed, that he was told he could sign away his constitutional rights. Could something like that actually happen? Would there be any kind of protection for him?
Well, I was referring to the past episodes. I'll look forward to the one tonight. Well, you know, George, I'll have to look at this. I have heard about this exact story. I've heard about it as kind of a preview of your program. I'm visiting with you once before. I'm anxious to get the facts. I think it's something we should look into, and I think John Glenn's Government Operations, this would be the appropriate committee to look into this.
The reason I run that clip from November 1989 is because when the news broke in the New York Times, December 2017, that Harry Reid had sponsored this program, it got $22 million. Some of the twitphologists and debunkers had jumped on it and said, well, Harry Reid doesn't care about UFOs. I can't believe he's interested in this at all. This is some kind of a scam. He's getting $22 million to give to some Nevada businessman who's one of his political donors. That Harry Reid doesn't really care about UFOs at all. In 1989, in that clip, Reid confirmed that he and I had been in communication about it, and that he was in fact interested in it as far back as then. And I know, I can just tell you flat out that he's been interested in it all those years since. Now, 28 years after that interview, which by the way aired on the day that we revealed Bob Lazar's identity on the air, there was another pivotal interview from Senator Reid. It was the 2 days after the New York Times story broke, and Reid had called me in the weeks before that story was going to break and asked me not to do the same thing. So I had known about OSAP, I knew about the secret UFO study and Bigelow and Bass and all that stuff. I was allowed to be a fly on the wall all those years. And when I heard the New York Times is going to break the story, which I had been sitting on for a long time at the request of those people that we're talking about, I said, well, I want to break it. I don't want to be sitting on this and let them do it. I want to break it. And the opinion from Bigelow and Reid was, and Tom DeLonge, that if I broke the story, the New York Times might not do it. And me being just a small fish in a pond, it should take one for the team, which I did. They very gently had to let me know that I, for whatever work I do out here in the desert, I am not the New York Times, which I grudgingly accepted. Okay. I understood the importance of the Times doing the story, and I figured, well, I'm going to know more about it than they are anyway, so I'll do all the follow-ups, which that's how it worked out. But Reid had promised me he'll give me the first on-camera interview after the Times story, and he kept his promise. And this is what we talked about. Well, I guess not. Well, what he did is explain in the soundbite that we were going to run there, he explained how the $22 million had been acquired. He went into a room with a skiff room with Senators Daniel Inouye and Ted Stevens. They put their cards on the table about the UFO issue. Both of those guys were interested in it, but had never done anything. So they said, yeah, let's get some money for it. And the $22 million was acquired. And then they were going to put it out for a bid to this guy. I'll tell you about Robert Bigelow. a little bit. The study that was authorized was managed by the Defense Intelligence Agency, and it was initiated by this guy who's a brilliant rocket scientist who works for DIA. He has 2 PhDs, and he called up Bob Bigelow. He wrote him a letter and asked about Skinwalker Ranch, we're going to get into a visit that he made to Skinwalker Ranch and how that affected him. He went back to Washington, met with Reed, made the proposal to those 2 senators, the 3 senators that I mentioned, and OSAP was born. Robert Bigelow, of course, has been described in all kinds of sinister terminology over the years. He's shadowy, he's a CIA guy, he's secretive, he works for the CIA, he owns a tea company, he owns casinos. Most of that, of course, is absolutely ridiculous. He might as well be like a druid priest for all the skullduggery that's been attributed to him over the years. Again, as I'm saying, our story about UFOs and what's happening now has its roots here in Las Vegas. It goes back to that 9-part series. Right as soon as the series finished airing, I get a call from this guy. I'd never heard of him before. Of course, as we know, he has the budget suites of America. He's a multi-millionaire, now billionaire, and he was pretty influential in town and given all kinds of money to UNLV and other charities. But I'd never heard of him. He gets on the phone. Robert Bigelow here. Hey, I loved your series. Can we help you in some way? I said, what do you mean? Well, can we help you? Financial support for your investigations. I said, well, I can't do that. I work for KLAS TV, but thanks for the offer. Maybe I'll see you around. Bigelow is not one to be denied, though. So in the next days after that phone call, he reached out and found Bob Lazar, and they started hanging out. And he was getting Bob Lazar's story, getting to know him. And soon, within a week or so, I was in that group as well, meeting in bars and restaurants and talking UFOs until late into the night. So we became sort of friends over the years. Back at that time, Bigelow had already had a lifelong interest in UFOs. There were some family experiences that got him on that path. He was reading avidly everything he could get his hands on, doing the same thing I was at the same time period of trying to absorb as much as you could, figure out separating the wheat from the chaff, what was real and what wasn't. But he was frustrated. You know, he started giving money to UFO researchers and investigators, people like Linda Howe, Stan Friedman, John Carpenter, Dr. John Mack, Bud Hopkins, that they would help support their investigations and learn what they could. Eventually, he decided to step it up a little bit, and he offered $1 million to the 3 leading UFO organizations so they could fund research, that they could get out and have boots on the ground when cases erupt. They're always complaining they had no money. He just put one condition on it. You have to be able to get along, and I want you to spend the money on investigations. And of course, they screwed it up. So he withdrew from that. Then he had the idea to create his own UFO organization called NIDS. National Institute for Discovery Science. And it had 2 goals. One was, are we alone in the universe? Is there something to ETs, UFOs? And the second was, do we survive physical death? Does the human consciousness go on? Is there something beyond death? The 2 biggest questions of human existence in all likelihood. So he funded NIDS. He put together a world-class science advisory board made up of just an amazing array of people. Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the 6th man to walk on the moon. Dr. Hal Puthoff, a name that is well known here for his years of looking into different UFO topics and remote viewing. Had worked as a contractor for CIA. Dr. Kit Green, similar kind of a background, brilliant neuroscientist. Dr. Jacques Vallée was on that board. There was another astronaut, the last man to walk on the moon, Harrison Schmitt, who also at that time was a U.S. Senator, and just an amazing group of people. NIDS also had sort of a rapid response team. They put together a scientific team that consisted of Dr. Eric Davis, Dr. Colin Kelleher, who was a co-author with me on a book that we'll get into in a minute. They had a full-time veterinarian on the staff so that if there was a cattle mutilation somewhere, they jump on a plane, they go to the site, they collect evidence. They studied black triangles. They wrote a lot of scientific papers. A lot of what they did was posted on their website. I know they're condemned for all kinds of secrecy and what they haven't told the world, but they were pretty transparent in those days. John Alexander, Dr. John Alexander, Colonel Alexander, who will be speaking here after me this morning, was right there from the beginning. It was an amazing organization. And just by luck, they had their first full Science Advisory Board meeting in January 1996, and they invited me to be a speaker. I had been to Russia and came back with a bunch of once classified documents from their Ministry of Defense about Russia's UFO studies. So I got to make a presentation before all this incredible group in a room and got to meet them, and was allowed over the next few years to be a fly on the wall for what NIDS was up to. I couldn't always report on it. Sometimes I could. But I was allowed to know what was going on, and it gave me a great advantage in terms of dealing with the rest of UFO world and figuring out who was full of baloney and who wasn't. It was an incredible organization and a great model, and they did a lot of great work. After that first meeting where I got to speak, I reached out to Harry Reid, and it was I told him I'd keep him abreast of what was going on, and I told him about NIDS and this amazing group. And I'd hoped that he was going to say, hey, can I get an invitation? Which he did. Hey, can I sit in on that? And I asked Bigelow. Bigelow and Reid started talking, and that friendship that developed out of there had far-reaching ramifications, more far-reaching than many of us could have imagined at the time. Reid did attend one of those Science Advisory Board meetings later in the year, I think August. He was blown away, and whatever interest he had in UFOs before then, it magnified tenfold after that. He was all in after that. And he and Bigelow maintained a dialogue that continued for many years up to the present day. 1996 was also a momentous time for NIDS, in that is when Robert Bigelow and John Alexander flew to Utah, met with this ranch owner, bought the ranch that's now known as Skinwalker Ranch, and put a team in there. Put a scientific team in there with cameras and sensors and gear, and they were there often 24/7 for months and months and months. And the stories that had attracted them there started with UFOs, that there had been a lot of UFO activity for decades in the Uinta Basin, that this particular property had not only structured craft, but orbs of different sizes and shapes that had different effects on people, that there had been creatures, sightings there, sort of like Bigfoot, other kinds of animals that shouldn't be there. They had had a number of cattle mutilations or animals that completely disappeared, dogs that had been vaporized. The family that lived there for 20 months felt like they were under surveillance the entire time. The mother, father, 2 kids who'd been straight-A students were a mess. They were psychologically tortured. They had physical effects. It was a mess. They wanted out. So Bigelow and John flew to the ranch, met with the rancher, heard these stories, and bought it. And NIDS established a permanent presence on the ranch, and they started collecting information. And the scientists and the teams who were there had their own experiences and documented a lot of stuff that had never been made public until years later. Now, I was allowed to know about what was going on there, but they didn't want me to report on it because they were worried that it would be overrun by UFO curious people and ghost investigators and things of that, which of course is exactly what happened later. So it was an amazing living laboratory for UFOs and the paranormal during the NIDS era. And of course, I kept Harry Reid informed about this as well, and Bigelow told him as well. Around 2000, which is when activity at the ranch sort of took a little nosedive. It kind of got tired of being hunted by the NIDS team and went underground. So at that point, I'd been pestering Bigelow to let me start going to the ranch, and he allowed me to go and bring a cameraman. And I made the first of a couple of dozen trips there to build what I hoped would be a documentary film about the ranch. It wasn't to come out for a long time and in a different form than I anticipated, but eventually a lot of what we shot back then did come out in a documentary. In 2002, Bigelow gave me the green light to write a newspaper article about the ranch, and from then on, it sort of exploded. The newspaper is the Las Vegas Mercury, a little weekly paper here in Las Vegas. We put those articles out. They went all over the world, and people started descending on the property. UFO hunters, ghost investigators, ne'er-do-wells, trespassers, vandals, knuckleheads of all kinds, and caused a lot of problems in there. And I'm sure Bigelow regretted having me write that article, but he did give us the green light to write a book. It was called Hunt for the Skinwalker. It was published in 2005, co-written by Dr. Colin Kelleher and I, and it laid bare the story of everything that happened in the history of the ranch and the NIDS investigation. And it exploded as well and set off a new stampede. One of the people who read that book 2 years ago after it came out was a scientist for the DIA. Let's see where we are here. This rocket scientist read it, and he thought, well, maybe there are some national security implications. The witnesses had described what they called essentially holes in the sky, almost wormholes. There was an example where the NIDS team was on the property, and this ball of light was seen floating, hovering a few feet off the ground, and it started stretching out. It could be seen in the infrared spectrum through this infrared lens up on top of the Skinwalker Ridge. The guys down below could only see a dirty snowball, but this thing got bigger and bigger and bigger, and until it looked like a tunnel, and something started crawling through it. And this something that crawled all the way through stood up. It's like 8 feet tall, black humanoid-shaped thing. No facial features could be seen, and it ran up the hill towards where these other guys are watching it. Needless to say, they got out of there. That suggestion, though, that this is some kind of a hole into some other reality is one of the things that caught the attention of this DIA scientist. His name has been mentioned elsewhere. He's asked me not to use it, but I'm sure if you wanted to look it up, you could figure it out. He writes to Bigelow, as I said. He writes this amazing letter, says, I'm with the DIA. I have approval from my superiors to go ahead and take a look at the ranch. Can I go there? Bigelow says, come on out to Las Vegas. He did. He flew with Bigelow on his jet to Vernal, Utah. They went to the ranch, spent about 2 hours while they were there, and the most amazing things happened. While they're sitting in the main ranch house, talking to the two caretakers who lived there, Bigelow, the scientist, and these two, something appeared inside the ranch house that was only viewable by this guy. And it was a technological object that appeared right in the room where only he could see it. He's seeing it out of the corner of his eye. He doesn't say anything. He's kind of wondering, is this some kind of a joke or a test or something? He doesn't say anything to Bigelow or anyone until after he gets off the property. And this thing looked like Mike Oldfield, Tubular Bells, that old album. If you old farts who remember that music from a long time ago, it's sort of almost a figure eight kind of a thing, and it was tubular. And it appeared before him. He made drawings of what it looked like. He was really moved by this, that there really is something going on. I mean, what are the chances that while a scientist from the DIA is there to evaluate the ranch, something appears right in the living room of this house? He goes back to Washington. He writes up a proposal, submits it to his bosses at the DIA, and they said, yeah, let's go for it. So the scientist called for a meeting with Harry Reid. Reid calls in Stevens and Inouye. They talked it over, and within a couple of minutes, they decided to fund this study. And the study was AAWSAT, Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program. Now I'll show you. Bass is the subcontractor that Bigelow created to house the contract. And then this is the contract. The bid went out in 2008. The contract was awarded in September of 2008. $10 million was provided for the first year. We made these documents public in 2018 after the New York Times story had broken. And it laid out what was expected for the money. Nowhere does it mention UFOs or UAPs or cattle mutilations or anything of that sort. They didn't want to highlight that. They didn't want to attract too much attention within the Pentagon hierarchy, or have somebody come and try to steal their money, or have higher-ups be worried about what a weirdo study is being paid for by tax dollars. So it was kept really quiet to one degree or another. 1 week after Robert Bigelow signed the contract with the DIA, he went on coast to coast with me, and he announced it to the world. And I know a lot of people think this is all kept hush-hush, but he announced that he had created BASS, that it was going to study UFOs and related phenomena, and that he had partners, unnamed partners. Now, he didn't spell out that it was a 3-letter agency, but the trail of breadcrumbs was pretty clear. And if you were paying attention, which most people were not, you could have figured out that something really cool was going on. Bigelow, of course, in his typical fashion, as soon as even before he got the contract, he spent about $1 million to prepare BASS in case they got it. He bought buildings, he restructured buildings, he built skiffs inside his facilities at Bigelow Aerospace. He was ready to hit the deck running, and he did. Within a couple of months after getting the contract, they had hired close to 50 people, investigators, ex-cops, ex-military, people who are great with computers, and people who knew their way around the UFO topic, and they were ready to get going. They started cranking out reports, voluminous reports, big, thick binders of things on different topics that we've covered here. The Northern Tier UFO cases where UFOs appeared over those nuclear missile bases, for example, did a lot of digging into that. They sent investigators to other countries, Brazil, to interface with military folks in those countries and put together files, whatever information they could acquire there. They had rapid response teams where they would go out, and if there'd been a UFO flap or an incident somewhere, or somebody videotaped or photographed a UFO, an unknown, they'd go out there, interview the witnesses, collect all the information, put together a database that included a lot of files. That database was created by Jacques Vallée, who Grace is a great computer scientist, and hopefully someday we'll get to see all the stuff that's in there. For now, I think a lot of FOIA requests have been filed, but none of that information has come forward except for the stuff that we've released. Sort of as a public face of that program, one of the first things they did was they created, in essence, a scientific and technological baseline. Dr. Hal Puthoff oversaw this part of the program. He commissioned 38 different papers on topics related to advanced propulsion, wormholes, hypersonics, materials science, the kinds of things that would be a baseline for NIDS, for BASS, to evaluate UFO information. Here's what we know humans have, and if it doesn't fit into those parameters, it could be something else. And they also had those papers sort of project out 40 or 50 years to see where these kinds of subjects might go in the decades ahead, what humans might be able to accomplish. And I know that when most of those 38 papers, well, at least about a third of them have been made public by now, including most of those by me. When they first came out, leaked out, some of the snark said, oh, this is junk science, it's goofy, it's science fiction, what a waste of money. Is this all we get for $22 million? Well, of course, it wasn't all they got for $22 million. I think about $500,000 was spent on these papers. Some of them were written by people who worked with BASS, like Eric Davis and Hal Puthoff, but others were written by scientists who were specialists in particular disciplines. They were really well received in military and intelligence circles and by defense contractors. They really liked these papers. They thought it really did a service. It wasn't until UFO world got a look at them that suddenly they had to be debunked or subjected to snark. This is Robert Bigelow. He doesn't give a lot of interviews. He started doing some for Bigelow Aerospace. He did one with Joe Rogan. But the first one that he ever did on any subject was with me back in, I think, 2007. And then after the news about OSAP, ATIP came out in 2017, 2018, it's pretty hard to get Bigelow and pin him down to talk about what had been going on. We're going to hear from him in just a second. Well, let's go to it now.
I meant your other interest that the public knows you for.
Oh,
esoteric topics.
The unidentified objects that people wonder what are flying around. Sure I do, because it's the epitome of potential that we are barely able to even sniff at. And the magnitude of that is so profound in so many different ways. I can't think of anything that comes close that mankind has even started to approach that even remotely equals the dynamics of that subject. It's beyond belief.
It demonstrates what's possible.
Yeah, and then even beyond that, because we don't even know, we may even see the bare tip of the iceberg on that, as you know. And so I don't think we even fully realize at all what's possible. We are sniffing at that, and we see signs of that, and we have information about it. And now we have where military pilots are coming forward and talking about it, and other kinds of things going on behind the scenes. And boy, once you've had an introduction to that, it's very, very hard to let go.
You haven't spoken about it really since all the news broke, but I mean, your fingerprints are all over that stuff. You helped make all that happen.
Well, I don't know about that. I think that the future here is what's potentially interesting. If these exposures and these exhibitions that are currently ongoing, especially off the East Coast, and they have been for pretty heavy for the last 5 years. If that gets the right, if they continue and they provide the opportunity for investigation and to create the awareness, not just with the military, but and government folks, but be able to be sanctioned and confirmed as an actual reality, that this phenomena is real. It actually exists, and we're actually achieving a confirmation of sorts, without knowing who, what, or why, or where it's coming from or anything. At least that's a big step that's never happened before.
I think Mr. Bigelow is rightfully proud of the work that Bass did, and wishes it could have gone on, thinking that, wow, it could have really made some progress by now if it had been allowed to go on, but it didn't, and we're going to get into that in a moment. I talked to him again. I did a long interview. It covered his whole life earlier this year, and got into asking him about OSAP. He won't mention the name. He still doesn't mention it, because I think in the back of his head, he still hopes that there might be a new program at some point. So I'd ask him, well, hey, did you guys get any metamaterials, any crashed saucers to analyze, which a lot of people have speculated about. Stemming back again to the New York Times story. The Times had said that modifications were made to Bigelow Aerospace to prepare to receive those metamaterials and analyze them. So a lot of people figured, including me, for a while, that maybe they had it. Because some of those guys who worked for Bass talked about the materials, had done some analysis at some point. But Bigelow said, no, we never had it. We never had any saucers. We never had any crash retrieval materials at Bigelow Aerospace. But I have the feeling that they had seen it. And he declined to be too specific about it because, again, I think he doesn't want to violate any confidences or security oaths, because he still has hopes that maybe there will be another program sometime in the future. The 38 papers. So that's the list of the 38 papers. And again, some people make fun of them as science fiction or junk science. These are pretty distinguished people that were selected to write the papers. They had no idea they were writing a paper for a secret DIA UFO program, but they were excited about the assignment. Give us the state of the art in terms of your specific topics, and then tell us what will be coming down the road 40 minutes from now. Eric Davis wrote a couple of those papers, anti-gravity, wormholes, a lot of really interesting topics. One of them was written by a UNLV professor here named Bill Coulthard, and he wrote about hypersonics. Now in 2009, maybe how to track hypersonic craft through space and the atmosphere might have seemed like a really far out suggestion and a sci-fi topic for the future, but here we are, years later, and hypersonics are very much in the news. The Russians say that they are developing hypersonic weapons, that they've already got them, that they're basically undetectable. So the report that was written for Bass back then was in fact pretty timely, ahead of its time. The guy who oversaw the 38 papers was Dr. Hal Puthoff. And of course his name has been linked to remote viewing, the creator of the remote viewing program for CIA, early investigator of that. With UFO technology, he's been mentioned in connection with all kinds of cutting edge technology and projects over the years. He made his first public presentation about OSAP and ATIP here in Las Vegas in June of 2018 and talked about the papers and the goals of the program.
Third area, unidentified aerial phenomena, I have not published anything in. Why? Because the program I was involved in the Pentagon and in the intelligence community has been top secret, behind the scenes, and only recently has there been release of information about the program. And so this is the first chance that I've had a chance to actually appear before the public and speak about details of the program and not go to jail. Well, there's a twofold nature of the threat. First of all, you've got these advanced aerospace vehicles flying around that we don't know where they come from, who's driving them, what the intent is, possibly off-world even. But the future threat was actually, as far as the Department of Defense went and the intelligence community, one of the greater concerns. What happens if potential adversaries achieve significant breakthroughs by getting hold of advanced technology, either based on their study of the phenomena or from sensor data or crash retrieved materials? Then that could provide a problem for the United States in the sense of threat. And there's reason to be concerned about that. Ex-Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is the one who initiated the program. Top-rated F-18 pilots who encountered advanced aerospace vehicles at close range were permitted to come forward and tell their stories, which up till now they hadn't, because they didn't want to lose their flight status by reporting what they had found, at least publicly. And a number of significant Department of Defense and intelligence community officials have come forward to talk about the reality of this phenomena and the fact that there were programs going on. Well, one of the critical issues is that there's so much high-level security and compartmentalization in this subject area, and there's a lot of it. It's difficult for contractors to obtain expert opinions on advanced technologies because they would expose why they were interested. So I acted as a surrogate. I was contracted to commission mostly unclassified white papers from experts around the globe, where their particular aerospace-related subject areas would be in 2050 as like a general survey of aerospace futures. I decided this would be the best way to get the best knowledge we had across many technologies without actually exposing why we wanted to know. So I let out 38 contracts over a 2-year period.
So how does OSAP become ATIP? There's a lot of confusion in there. Basically, Bass was working as the contractor for the OSAP program managed by the DIA from 2008 on, 2008, 2009, into 2010, and it was budgeted. At the same time, there was a small group, an auxiliary study, if you will, inside the Pentagon, and OSAP interacted with those guys. They didn't really have a name in those days. It was a small group that had confederates, if you will, in different parts of the defense establishment. Naval Intelligence, CIA, DIA, and then Lou Elizondo became part of that. He had, at the time, he oversaw a number of special access programs, SAPs, very sensitive, high-profile stuff. Anti-terrorism, anti-drug cartel. He was involved with Guantanamo Bay. He had a lot of stuff on his plate, but was asked to be part of this. So there was interaction between the OSAP guys and the people in the Pentagon that would later be known as ATIP. They would share information at times. The OSAP had a much broader perspective. They were looking at UFOs and in connection with other phenomena. UFO investigators, like the folks here, have been remiss to take a look at some of the weirder stuff that happens in proximity to UFO sightings, what we would call paranormal phenomena, or just strange stuff, cattle mutilations. What the heck has that got to do with UFOs? Or strange entity sightings, Bigfoot, poltergeist type stuff. Those things have been happening and associated with UFOs for a long time. OSAP focused on the UFOs as a starting point, but they took in information about the other weird stuff, such as at Skinwalker Ranch. Skinwalker Ranch was not a major focus of the OSAP program. It was sort of a bonus. It was part of the reason that Bass got the contract to begin with, because there you have what in essence is a living laboratory of weird stuff, UFOs and paranormal, a place where scientists, investigators could go and check it out. They didn't spend a lot of money on Skinwalker Ranch during that study, but they did spend money and put resources into a broader program around Skinwalker Ranch. They had investigators on the ground for months at a time interviewing people who lived around the ranch. They'd go there and hear their stories, get them to open up. They had to keep their identities secret, but they collected a great deal of information, put it all into a report about how broad and how weird the phenomena in that part of the world is. They heard stories about creatures, gargoyles, things of that sort. Information that has not been made public, but hopefully will someday. That was part of what OSAP did. The guys in the Pentagon had a much narrower focus. They were looking strictly at military encounters with UFOs, nuts and bolts flying saucers that appear over sensitive military bases, such as nuclear facilities, or interact with U.S. military assets, such as carrier groups, things of that sort. That's what that small confederation of people inside the Pentagon did. They did not have a budget. They did not have an office. It was informal. They had approval to do this from higher ups, way higher ups, but not everyone in the chain of command knew about it. Lou Elizondo was working on this program, and his immediate supervisor did not know it. So later, when he stepped out on the stage in Seattle with rock star Tom DeLonge, 2 days after he had resigned from the Pentagon, his boss was really ticked off, and his colleagues were really surprised. But that is what happened. So this small group inside the Pentagon was interacting with BASS and OSAP and still doing their own things. And the strength that they had, even though they had no budget or office, is they had information, they had contacts, they had inside access. They could see sensitive materials about really dramatic encounters that maybe the guys at BASS could not see. And I'll just tell you that some of the same people who were part of that group that later became known as ATIP are the same folks who stuck around long enough to be involved with what was dubbed the UAP Task Force. They were working on this stuff before the name UAP Task Force was ever created by Congress a year ago. Now they've got a name and will soon, I hope, have a budget and an office. But at that time, both during the BASS era, the ATIP era, and the UAPTF, prior to the creation of it, they had no name. They were just doing a job. As we know, Lou Elizondo became disillusioned with the job that was being done. He thought that this was a lot more important than it was being handled by his bosses. He thought that he'd give it some money, some resources, that it needs a lot more than OSAP's $22 million or the non-budget that ATIP was getting to pursue this, that it was bigger and more important than that. And when he couldn't get any traction, he resigned. A great job, a career job that he could have held on forever, and he left it all behind. And the next time we see him is on that stage in Seattle, October of 2017, with rock star Tom DeLonge to announce the launch of TTSA, To the Stars Academy. Also on the stage, Dr. Hal Puthoff, Jim Semivan, who just retired from the CIA, a career with CIA, the head of special projects for Lockheed Skunk Works, and a guy named Chris Mellon, who had spent a lifetime as a public servant working in intelligence matters for Congress and then later in the Pentagon. And I think most of UFO world and the larger world didn't pay any attention to it, even though what Lou Elizondo said that day was really important. He said basically that there had been a program, that there had been a study, and that this stuff is real and worth studying. 2 months later, of course, the New York Times blows that wide open and makes a big story out of it, and then the world did start paying attention. But if we had all been watching at that time, we would have had a sort of a preview of what was to come. I think KLAS TV covered it, and Leslie Kane wrote an article for USA Today, and the rest of the media pretty much ignored it. I interviewed Lou shortly after that newspaper article came out, but I had actually met him before. 2 days after TTSA made its announcement, Elizondo came to Las Vegas with Tom DeLonge, met with Bigelow, took a tour of Bigelow Aerospace, then we had dinner. I was invited to come along, got to see those amazing videos that the world now knows, Tic Tac and Gimbal and Go Fast, and met Lou for the first time and talked about TTSA and where I was heading. Bigelow was encouraged to invest in TTSA. He went back and forth about it for a couple of months and then ultimately decided not to. And of course, as we now know, TTSA has reverted back to just To the Stars. Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon left. But if all TTSA was able to accomplish was getting that New York Times story done and being there as a launching pad for Mellon and Elizondo, then it really did a great service for this topic. Back to BASS. One of the things that shows how the people inside the Pentagon worked with the BASS folks outside, the OSAP folks, is the Tic Tac incident. Just by coincidence, one of the first people that Bigelow hired at Bass when he was putting together a workforce of about 50 people was a former military aviator named Doug Kurth. And while they were talking to him, he revealed that there had been this incident in 2004 off the coast of San Diego involving what naval aviators had dubbed the Tic Tac. So Bass, as one of its first initiatives, reaches out to its compadres inside the Pentagon and says, let's see what we can put together on this. And they went to work. And there was that little confederation started sharing information. Files were collected. There had been an investigation of Tic Tac in 2004, a very brief collection of information, and a couple of witnesses were interviewed, and then that was put into a file, and the file got stuck in a drawer. And the admiral who was in charge of that carrier group didn't want to have a delay because of this weird encounter that would stop him from taking his carrier group to the Middle East. So it got shit canned, pardon my language. It got stuck into a drawer. These guys from that work with Bass resurrected it. They put together a report, a 13-page report. Oh, this is not it. This is Lou Elizondo, I think. Yeah, Lou Elizondo talking about OSAP.
And it was that name for about 9 months. And that program was later refined. It was a bit of a shotgun approach to the phenomena. So it included a lot of stuff in this program on trying to figure out how these things fly and where they're coming out of, where they're going, and things like that. When I came into the program, the name had just been changed to AATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP. Not Advanced Aviation, Advanced Aerospace. I know people keep saying it's Advanced Aviation. It's not, and eventually that'll come out too, and people will realize that's not the name. It's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And so when I came in, the name ATIP had already been issued, and that's what it was being referred to as. Now, whether it was not a nickname or a formal name, it was a formal name for us. It was briefed as ATIP. But if people want to, argue about semantics and they want to say it was a nickname, that's fine. But it wasn't really a nickname, at least not for me and the guys and the gals that were working with me. So it was ATIP, and that's how we briefed it. But anyways, that focus was really on the more of the nuts and bolts, looking at what it is and how does it work, right? And as I've said before many times, that was our focus, and that was ATIP's focus. So we went from a broad kind of spotlight approach to more of a narrowly focused laser approach, trying to figure out pieces of this, because it was just too much of the elephant to eat in one bite, frankly, in my opinion anyways. Could be wrong, but looking at now, hindsight being 2020, the AWSAP program, given the resources, $22 million would never be enough to really follow down each and every rabbit hole to do this conclusively, in my opinion anyways. So it was refocused to ATIP. I took over in 2010. The program continued to go as ATIP. 2012, that initial 5-year funding dried up. So we were issued more funding in 2013, 2014. Unfortunately, the verbiage in the way it was written in the bill, that when it finally came out, another office in the Pentagon took our money.
So if you're trying to figure out how OSAP becomes ATIP, join the crowd, how confusing it gets. So OSAP was the program. The first time the term ATIP ever appeared was in a letter written in June of 2009, I think it's June, maybe it's later, from Harry Reid to the Undersecretary of Defense. Excuse me. Reid was worried, and Bigelow were worried, that someone at the Pentagon was going to grab the funds. It's just how it works. You got a program, somebody will come and try to give you a haircut, they call it. And the $22 million, they had funding. It was secure going forward. But they didn't want to fight a budget battle every year, so they asked Reid if he could ask the Department of Defense to create a special access program so that every year wouldn't be another battle, that they could continue sort of at a low profile without worrying that someone would come and pilfer the funds. And in essence, that's exactly what ended up happening. Of course, we know what those images are. The Tic Tac and Gimbal and Go Fast. That is the That's the 13-page report that was prepared by the insider guys about the Tic Tac incident that ended up going to Bass. You notice that there's no insignia, there's no letterhead, there's no signature. Everyone is wondering who the mystery people were who put this together and how it ended up at Bass. Well, it was the process that I just described for you, is the group of insiders who'd been working with Bass put it together. They got input from several different agencies and then sent it along, and it ended up in the files of Bass. It has never, I think, been acknowledged by the Pentagon, but it is what people like Dave Fravor call the unofficial official report. And it was pretty comprehensive. They didn't talk to everybody who was involved in the Tic Tac incident, didn't get access to everything, but they did it the best job they could, keeping it low profile and not trying to draw attention to themselves. This is the letter that's written by Harry Reid to the Undersecretary of Defense, in which he's asking to make OSAP into a special access program. But he didn't use the name OSAP. And I think what you'll find is that the people who were behind the program didn't want the name out there. They didn't want to draw attention. So they used the term ATIP. And that was not the name of the program at the time, but it is the name that stuck. It's the one that even Hal Puthoff used in his presentation. It's the term that the New York Times used. But at the time that letter was written, ATIP did not exist. There was a group of people who were working with OSAP, but they didn't have a program of their own. There wasn't called ATIP. That name came later. By the way, of course, there was a really complicated scenario that I can't really explain about that letter. There is no, if you file a FOIA and try to see if there was a response to it, there is none. It kind of leaked out. The letter leaked out and caused a great deal of embarrassment. It drew attention among higher-ups in the Pentagon that there was this crazy program that was studying UFOs, and so new leadership at the DIA started staring at it program and wondering, is this a good thing for us to do? The people who had started it before and supported it were gone. The new leadership was worried. Number one, they were worried about, hey, if this gets out, this could be a front page story in the New York Times. And of course, that's exactly what happened. The other group in the Pentagon, as hard as this is to believe, were opposed to that program because they felt that the phenomena is demonic. There were religious fundamentalists in different parts of the Pentagon who work together and stay in contact. They thought that studying UFOs, that putting resources into a place like Skinwalker Ranch invoked Satan, that it might invite Satan into our world as if he isn't here already, and so they wanted it killed. And so people came looking for that OSAP money. It was fully funded, and someone stole it. This is toward the end of 2009, after that letter created a bit of a stir, and the money was taken away. Bigelow continued to fund Bass, OSAP, for a year using his own money as different staff members were working with Congress to try to find a new home for it. A couple of other landing spots other than DIA initially supported the idea, and they looked like it was going to be ready to go, but in the end, the money was pulled. What was left over after OSAP and Bass went away was this small Confederate group inside the Pentagon that was still working, that never stopped working on trying to solve the UFO mystery and looking at cases, and eventually they came to be called ATIP. The name that was stuck in that letter became their name. It's the name that they went by, it's the name that the New York Times reported, it's the name that we all use now, although that was not the program at the beginning. And I know there's a great deal of confusion about that. The same people who were working for ATIP stuck around after Lou Elizondo left. And even though they didn't really have a name or a program, they still worked on this. And those people, a few of them at least, became what we know as the UAP Task Force. And that group, with no resources, no budget, has done an amazing job. I know that many people in the UFO world were disappointed by the public report that was finally released back in June. It's only a couple of pages. It doesn't name any specific cases. It doesn't include Roswell and Phoenix Lights and alien abductions and Area 51 or any of that juicy stuff that we talk about all the time. But for me, it represents a major change in how our military views UFOs. Actually, not a change in how they view it. They've always viewed it as serious. If you look at the FOIA records from the late 40s and 50s, the comments that were made back and forth between higher-ups in the Pentagon, they always took it seriously. They knew this wasn't us. This wasn't ours. It was technology beyond what we had, beyond what the Russians had, beyond what the Chinese have now. They felt that behind the scenes in memos and documents, they said, we need to study this. It's serious. But they would say something else to the public. All through Project Sign and Project Grudge and Project Blue Book, we're told it's no big deal, don't worry about it, no national security implications at all, and it was a lie. For the US government to now come out in a report in mild language, non-inflammatory language, to say, you know, we need to study this, it could have national security implications. They're not sharing all of the details with us, but it's exactly what Congress needed to go ahead and authorize an extension of the program to give the UAP task force more authority, which is what's in the new intelligence bill, to give them authority to go out to the Air Force and say, we want to see the files, to go to CIA and ask for stuff, and perhaps to eventually go after the Holy Grail, the goodies, crash retrieval stuff and whatever else might be hidden in the hands of contractors. That's the kind of authority they need, and that's the kind of authority I think Congress wants to give them. If they had just said it's aliens in that report, then any member of Congress who votes to support it would be pummeled in the next election for supporting spending tax dollars hunting aliens. This way, we can pretend that it's technology that a foreign government has, and the study can proceed without political fallout from the people who support it. One of the things that so we know that the UAP Task Force report had that little brief public report and another report that they gave to Congress. What is not as well known is that they prepared a detailed briefing document. And what the task force has done over the last couple of years, after bringing in pilots like Dave Fravor and Alex Dietrich and other aviators to speak behind closed doors, people like Eric Davis and others who testified before these two Armed Services Committees and Intelligence Committee about the UFO reality, they've also put together a briefing document for others, including their own higher-ups. So this is the UAP task force putting together a briefing document so they can tell members of Congress, the Joint Chiefs, and some defense contractors the reality of UFOs and what some of the evidence is. And including in that briefing document, which by the way is classified, there are a number of videos and photos. I happened to acquire some of them in 2019. I didn't make them public until this year because I thought they were classified. Turns out they're not. The images inside that classified report are exempt. They were not classified as of a couple of months ago. So if you had contacts and had somebody who is willing to share some of those images with us, you could do the kind of stories that Jeremy Corbell and I have been doing for the last 6 months. Those are photos captured of 3 images that were seen off the coast of Oceana. That's the gigantic naval base on the East Coast. And pilots, I said this at a Congress, UFO Congress 2 years ago, that pilots off the East Coast were seeing these things every day. Every day. They're not ours. And they were sitting right there in the avenue that is traveled, in the airspace that's traveled every day by pilots who fly out of that base, go to their training area, and then come back. And nobody knew what they were. So on one day in, I think it's March of 2019, this one air crew at an F-18 decided to take some photos. And they still don't know what they are. I know they don't look like the Starship Enterprise. Maybe they're a blimp, maybe they're a drone, but they're sitting right there off of our naval base off the East Coast, and they were seeing them every day. They also saw these cubes inside of spheres that were really weird, almost had collisions with them. So the US Navy, as we now know, relaxed its reporting requirements. It wanted to make it easy for naval aviators to go ahead and take photos, to gather information, to tell about it, to report when they encounter some of these things, because they wanted to collect the information for the UAP task force. This air crew, 2-member crew, decided to take them up on it. They took these photos, 3 objects photographed off the East Coast by the same crew in the same day. Now these things, what's weird about them is there were high winds, really high winds at this high elevation. These things remain stationary for hours, sometimes days. What drone does that? What's the power source? What balloon doesn't move around in the high winds way up at 20,000 feet? So they were mystified about what they were. We made some of them public earlier this year. And the Pentagon acknowledged that these photos were in fact taken by the Navy. The UAP task force, this is a slide prepared by the task force for its briefing document And these briefs were made to higher ups at the Pentagon and Congress. That slide was created by the task force, and this is a preposterous UFO that appeared over the USS Russell in July of 2019. There were 3 of them, and maybe more, and they looked like flying pyramids. And I know that there are a lot of debunkers who've said, this is bokeh, this is a reflection, this is an airplane. Well, it's not an airplane. What the UAP task force has that we do not have is all the sensor data that goes with this sighting. And that object was 700 feet off the deck. They used a rangefinder. It was 700 feet off the deck of the USS Russell in July of 2019. Now, in this same period, there were 9 US Navy warships 100 miles off the coast of San Diego that had these things, more than 100 objects over several days. They were detected on radar and other sensors. They could be seen physically but not show up on sensors. The Navy had no idea what the heck these things were. This is another one. There were as many as 14 of these spheres buzzing around the USS Omaha. Again, this is a slide from the presentation prepared by the UAP task force. 14 of these that were popping in and out of radar around the USS Omaha over a period of several hours. That particular object paced the ship for more than an hour. That's a thermal image. So if you're complaining about it being grainy, it's not a photograph, it's not a camera, it's a thermal image. They could detect it on the thermal image, but couldn't see it because it's pitch black. It's pitch black out in the middle of the ocean at night. And it paced them for an hour, and then it dipped into the ocean, at least that they think it dipped into the ocean, after about an hour. As I said, they were self-illuminated. They at first estimated they were about 6 feet in diameter, a perfect sphere. They now think maybe they were about 10 feet across, and there were a bunch of them. And they not only appeared on the thermal image, well, I guess we're not going to have the other image. They also were caught on radar. Those images were passed along to the UAP task force, and when Jeremy and I made them public, the Pentagon confirmed, yeah, they're real. You guys really, that's real. That was recorded by the Navy. The UAP task force does not know what these things are. UFO Twitter knows what they are and what they aren't. All the experts in Twitter can tell you that they're Chinese drones or this and that or glare or birds or whatever. They've got it figured out. But the US Navy, which has far more data and information and sensor data, doesn't know what they are. They are unknown. That's what was presented in the UAP task force report, and that's where it stands today. I think there are a lot more images, and probably we've been told about hints of really dramatic other images that the public has not yet seen, and maybe we'll see them in the near future. You know, the UAP task force, I got a couple minutes left here, so I'll wrap this up. I'm rooting for it. You know, I know it's not perfect, and the resources that it might get, if it gets $2 or $3 million a year, that would be amazing. I don't know what kind of budget it might get, but it's not enough. If we're going to get to the bottom of this, I think even Lou Elizondo, who really focused on nuts and bolts national security UFO cases during his time within ATIP, even he admitted to us in an interview that if we're ever going to solve this mystery, you need a broad approach. I think John Alexander might talk about that coming up. OSAP had that broad approach, looking at all the other related phenomena that pop up in proximity to UFOs. We don't understand the relationship, why a place like Skinwalker Ranch exists, why UFOs are seen in the same place with Bigfoot and cattle mutilations and poltergeist type activity, all kinds of weirdness. We don't understand it. But we're never going to understand it if we don't try. So we need to at least try. Maybe we'll fail. Maybe it's something that's always going to be tantalizingly out of our reach a little bit. But we have to try. And because of the changes that started right here in Las Vegas, Harry Reid, Bob Bigelow, Colin Kelleher, Hal Puthoff, the NIDS, the BASS, that eventually leads to OSAP and ATIP, and even the folks at TTSA have an imprint from Las Vegas and the programs that started here. Because of all the effort of all those people, we are far down the road than where we were when I started on this in 1989. I never thought I would live to see these kind of changes. And it's really exciting to me. I know we get frustrated. We'd like to know more. The people who are newest to this topic seem to have the least patience. For them, this seems like a drip, drip, drip. It's really slow. For me,
for us old timers who've been at this a long time, it's a blur of activity. It's an amazing sequence of events that's happened in a short amount of time. So I'm excited about the future. I'm excited about the changes that have happened. I'm proud of the work that was done here to try to get this down the road. You know, Harry Reid has said, we need to figure this out for our own interests. I mean, the nation that figures out how tic-tac flies, the nation that does that first wins. He said the Russians and Chinese are working this, that maybe they've made some progress. Bob Bigelow, in the last conversation I had with him, he's kind of careful in the words he used, but he says the next step could be the goodies, you know? That's the ultimate, that's the holy grail. If we have materials, bits and pieces of crash retrieval stuff, which a lot of people say we do, if we have craft, entire craft that some people have said exist, if they're stashed in some hangar controlled by Lockheed or Northrop, I hope the UAP task force gets the authority to go find it. I suspect that once they get closer to the goodies, that we're going to have a lot of pushback. You're already seeing it in some media articles telling everybody, hey, cool this UFO stuff, you're never going to get anywhere, you might as well move on to something else. There'll be a lot more serious pushback if anybody starts going after that stuff. But, you know, as I said, it's an exciting time. I'm encouraged by the progress. I look forward to the next step. And, you know, the job of scientists and journalists, as I always say, the job of science and journalism is to investigate the unexplained, not to explain the uninvestigated. Thank you very much.